As tensions continue between Canada and the U.S., many Canadians are rethinking their travel plans to U.S. destinations. The Flight Centre Travel Group says 20% of customers have canceled their trips to the U.S. in the last 3 months. WestJet tells CTV Morning Live that they have observed a shift in bookings from the U.S. to other sun destinations such as Mexico and the Caribbean, while Air Canada is offering less flights to go to hotspots in America. But many are still traveling, and different locations come with different health risks. Joining us today is Kelly Haggarty, a pharmacist and travel health expert, to share advice on how Canadians can stay healthy while traveling abroad. And we want to remind you, this segment is for information purposes only. Good morning to you, Kelly.
Good morning, Rosie. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you on. Got a ton of questions for you. Okay, so with a lot of Canadians traveling outside the U.S., what health risks should they be aware of compared to traveling within the U.S.?
Great question. I think when we look at the numbers in the past that have traveled to the U.S. and we see that change going down into southern regions, when we realize that we already had about 7 million Canadians every year going to the Mexico and Caribbean areas, it'll be super interesting to see how many more Canadians head in that direction this year. And we know that when you get into those further southern regions, we have to think about food and waterborne illnesses and mosquito illnesses that we wouldn't see, for example, in the US. And that's examples, things like hepatitis A, traveler's diarrhea, in particular that caused by enterotoxigenic E. coli. We also see, of course, a lot more mosquito diseases, as I said. And a lot of people are familiar with malaria, but don't think about dengue fever, Zika virus, and a big one now is chikungunya virus, which has spread dramatically through that region over the last decade or so.
So we do hear a lot about the food and waterborne illnesses when traveling, but how real is the risk of those viruses that you mentioned?
It's actually a significant risk. We know from our data that about 98% of travelers will consume risky food and water products, food and beverage products, I guess I should say, in their first 2 weeks of travel. And we also know that we will have 1 to 2/3 of people get a travel-related diarrhea. So it is a significant risk for people. Fortunately, we can educate, we can teach people how to eat and drink carefully, and we can also offer vaccines for these types of things. So it is really important, I think, that travelers recognize the risk. As I said, 98% of travelers, even within 3 days of travel, consume risky food and water. So education is a key point of prevention. And then, of course, we look at the vaccines, and we are fortunate in Canada that we have a drinkable vaccine, no needle, drinkable, for travelers' diarrhea from one type of enterotoxigenic E. coli. Now, what's important to realize, there's a lot of reasons people can get diarrhea, and it can range from mild to severe, but the number one cause in that region is actually this one type of E. coli, and our vaccine that we have for this, called Dukoral, is actually quite effective. We drink it a couple weeks before we go, with a second dose about 1 week before you go. And of course, when you couple that with education strategies and knowing how to treat diarrhea if it happens, it can help people have a much safer, much healthier vacation.
Now, you've got the drinkable vaccine that you mentioned. What else can travelers do to protect themselves?
Well, I think we always want to start with education and prevention. So obviously, we start with not eating and drinking risky foods and beverages, as I mentioned earlier. So when you think of risky beverages, think about tap water, avoiding that, sticking to bottled beverages, avoiding ice, for example, when you're off the resort world. Then, of course, we look at foods. Raw food will always be the biggest risk. So trying to avoid raw vegetables, trying to avoid fruit that has a thin skin. A thick-skinned fruit is always a much safer option than a thin-skinned fruit. Then, of course, we have to make sure people know what to do if they get ill, and that is rehydration being the cornerstone of therapy. So staying well hydrated, anti-diarrheal medications, sometimes anti-nausea and anti-diarrhea medications go hand in hand. And then, of course, we look at the prevention, as I mentioned before, which would be something like a vaccine like Dukoral to help reduce risk. But knowing what to do ahead of time and knowing how to treat those initial symptoms is incredibly important.
We're just about out of time, but Kelly, what should be on every traveler's health checklist before heading on these vacations?
I think we always start, of course, with the legal things, making sure you've got your passport. Out of country medical insurance is so important. Then we're going to look at booking a trip to your family physician, your nurse practitioner, your pharmacist, maybe a travel medicine clinic like mine. In some cases, primary care can take care of these issues for you, or they may send you on, refer you to a full travel clinic like me. I always suggest people look at that before they actually get really close to the trip, because depending on your previous vaccination status, where you're going, they may want to see you anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks before the trip, or in some cases, just a few weeks before. But it's not really a last minute thing, although we can do a lot within 2 weeks. Then, of course, make sure you've got a good little kit packed. Have your antidiarrheals, have your, in some cases, antibiotics for travelers' diarrhea are needed. Making sure that you've got rehydration solution and all those other good things that you want to pack in your travel kit.
Pharmacist and travel health expert Kelly Haggarty, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me this morning.